Amen. Now I understand it wasn't a negative thing or a critical comment that I've been hearing from people, but I have heard that this is a lot of information. So if you don't mind, we're just going to step back and do a little bit of revision just for a few minutes. And we also have a couple of new faces, so welcome. We looked at Acts chapter 27 and picked up the number 273 that you could place as a symbol of the Levites between midnight cry and Sunday law. We took that to 273 BC and saw that Egypt went into an alliance with Rome, or began this diplomatic relationship. And the reason that Egypt ever recognized Rome was because Rome had just fought the Pyrrhic War with Pyrrhus. So this was Rome versus Pyrrhus, but it was also northern Italy versus southern Italy, the king of the north versus the king of the south. In that war there were 3 battles. In the 3rd battle Pyrrhus lost, he flees. Shortly after that Egypt go to Rome, and then the next year Rome goes to Egypt, headed by Fabius Maximus Sturgis, his name meaning the maximum flood. Pyrrhus died 46 years old, and Tarentum, the major Greek city-state in the south, fell. So we took Pyrrhus as a symbol, and we decided that we would trace his life not from his birth but from his involvement in the world affairs as the world was at that time. And he entered world politics during the 4th Diadochi War. This was the Diadochi Wars, were the 4 wars by which Alexander the Great's empire was broken down from dozens of generals that it had been split into at his death to our 4 famous generals of Daniel chapter 8, Lysimachus, Seleucus, Ptolemy and Cassander. We saw that the 4th Diadochi War began in 307 BC, and it began with Demetrius freeing Athens from a dictator placed by Cassander. Cassander had placed that dictator in Athens 10 years previously, and this sparked the new war. In the middle of this war, Pyrrhus and Demetrius go into an alliance. So this war was between our 4 famous generals versus Antigonus, Demetrius, and Demetrius in an alliance with Pyrrhus. So Antigonus and his son Demetrius, and Demetrius was in an alliance with Pyrrhus. This alliance came to use in 301 BC at the Battle of Ipsus, where 3 of our generals met Antigonus in battle and killed him. Demetrius and Pyrrhus are fleeing back to their own territories, their own holdings. Through some complicated events after Cassander's death, who was king of Macedonia, Pyrrhus and Demetrius divide Macedonia between themselves. These events put a strain on their alliance, and Pyrrhus invades Thessaly, part of Demetrius' empire, in 291 BC. In 289-288 BC, Demetrius responds to this antagonistic behaviour, and he marches his army up through Epirus and just ravages the country. They then sign a type of peace treaty, and Demetrius begins a massive military build-up program. 287 BC, our famous generals, the surviving ones of Lysimachus, Seleucus and Ptolemy, are sufficiently alarmed by this huge army that he is building that they ask Pyrrhus to go into an alliance with them. And Pyrrhus and our 3 allied forces diverge on Demetrius, and Demetrius is defeated. His empire, particularly Macedonia, divided into east and west, divided between Lysimachus and Pyrrhus. So in this history you have Pyrrhus fighting this tension with Demetrius, and now there's a new player. Now it's Pyrrhus versus Lysimachus. This sparks a cold war as neither are happy with just their half division, and Lysimachus, through sanctions and subterfuge, the elements of a cold war, takes the east from Pyrrhus, and Pyrrhus returns home with nothing but the borders of his own country. Here we also notice a scene change. In 285 BC, it's that initial spark of the Pyrrhic War, where Thurii, a Greek city-state normally allied to Greece and to Tarentum, the main city-state of southern Italy, changed their political alliance, and instead of turning to their Greek relatives, they turn to Rome. They renew that appeal around 283 BC, and in 282 Rome responds and places a garrison in Thurii. This antagonises Tarentum, who attack Thurii, expel the garrison, and pretty much declare Rome first declaring war then on Tarentum. Tarentum asks Pyrrhus to fight this war on their behalf, and he arrives in Tarentum in 280 BC. Really the preparation of the city itself. This is internal. Then we see 3 battles with Rome. The first battle he was unprepared for. This is a much smaller battle than the following 2, about half the size. Pyrrhus wins because of the elephants he brought with him, this being the first time Rome had encountered elephants. He marches on Rome after this battle, but due to coming winter, he isn't able to continue his success here. Over this winter time, Rome starts to prepare a comeback against those troublesome elephants, and they build 300 anti-elephant carts. The second battle at Asculum, twice the size of Heraclea. It's a 2-day battle. Rome brings these 300 anti-elephant carts, but they're just broken up, and Pyrrhus wins again. This is a Pyrrhic victory, what kind of coined the phrase a Pyrrhic victory. So while he wins in these 2 battles, it's at great loss to himself. So he steps back to rebuild. He goes down to Sicily, drives Carthage from the island, and pretty much establishes himself as a dictator in Sicily, to such an extent that Sicily then returned to Carthage and asked Carthage to free them from Pyrrhus. He desecrates a temple, but it does him no good. He's recalled to Italy when Rome marches south again, and he faces them in the Battle of Beneventum. He loses this battle when his own elephants turn and charge his own troops. So he loses again. This battle is decided by elephants, but by his own elephants. Then we have, as we marked before, 273 and 272 BC. So that is, in a nutshell, the life of Pyrrhus. Then we went to look at his country of Epirus and who Pyrrhus represents in history. We saw that the first known king of Epirus is Admetus, and from him Pyrrhus is the 10th. We saw that he ruled as a king, but then he was temporarily deposed when Neoptolemus II took the throne. Pyrrhus forced him into a co-rulership, and they co-ruled for a period of time before Pyrrhus had him killed, and then he took the throne for himself. There are 7 more kings after him before his nation is ruled by the Epirote League, a league of tribes. We saw that Pyrrhus, as representing the king of the south in our history, is a symbol of Vladimir Putin. We saw that Putin was president from 2000 to 2008 before he had to step back, having fulfilled the maximum 2 consecutive terms allowed under the Russian constitution. He takes a step back, Medvedev becomes president, but Putin is vice president, prime minister, and This is very much a co-rulership. Medvedev faithfully steps down after just one term, and Putin comes back in 2012. He comes back also changing term limits from a 4-year term to a 6-year term, so he's already establishing himself as 2024, if everything's still going, he'll still be in Russia. We then lined up Putin with Pyrrhus, but we also saw that Putin must also be typified by Stalin. So Stalin and Putin, the 1st and the 10th. We looked a little bit back into Pyrrhus's history and saw his father, Aeacides, was removed in a coup. Neoptolemus II temporarily took the throne. Aeacides comes back, but he's severely weakened and his government is toppled. Alcetus II, Pyrrhus's elder uncle, takes the throne, but he has an ungovernable temper and his own people rising up kill him. If we take that down to the history of Russia, we see Gorbachev is removed in a coup by Yanayev. Yanayev rules temporarily, signs a decree making himself acting president. Before Yanayev is toppled, Gorbachev comes back but severely weakened, and the West is looking to a Boris Yeltsin. Everything looks very positive under Boris Yeltsin, but he quickly loses the respect of his people, and a large part of that is not only the corruption inside his own government, but also his lack of self-control, him being a severe alcoholic, and that affected his health. What we didn't do yesterday to complete this line is bring this back to Stalin, so I just want to quickly do that. So previous to Stalin, who do we have? We have Lenin. Previous to Lenin was Tsar Nicholas II. We read yesterday that the day Gorbachev retired was the day that the Soviet Union ceased to exist. They lowered that flag the same evening that he abdicated. This was the end of the USSR. The day Tsar Nicholas abdicated was the end of the monarchy. Tsar Nicholas typifying Gorbachev. One steps down and ends the monarchy, one steps down and ends the Soviet Union. Then in steps Lenin. Lenin placed Stalin as secretary of the Soviet Union, the position he held for the rest of his life. Why did Lenin quit government? He had a series of strokes. That also came down to his health condition, not a lack of self-control, but still health-related. Yeltsin's widow still arguing that the reason he stepped down was because of his health. There was more to it than that, but you can see the link. So end of monarchy, temporary has to step down because of health. Lenin placed Stalin. End of USSR, Yeltsin, self-control, steps down, partly because of health, but he placed Putin in control. So we can see Stalin and Putin also are tightly linked. We took this model of Putin being represented by Stalin, and therefore also Pyrrhus as a representative of Stalin, and we pretty much are plotting the political life of not just Stalin but communist Russia, the Soviet Union. We didn't pick it up from its birth, but from the time it began to be involved in world affairs. we saw that it really became involved in 1939 with a proxy war, the Spanish Civil War. This was a proxy war between fascism and communism in Europe. 2/3 of Spain's gold reserves were shipped to the Soviet Union over this proxy war, the proxy war being 3 years long. We did mark a 10 because we can see in 1929 pretty much the Stalin solidifying his hold on power, beginning his personality cult, Mussolini taking down his last rivals in government, and Hitler beginning his meteoric rise from 1929 to 1933. You can mark the Lateran Treaty and the Great Depression. So I still wanted to note that there's a 10-year period here. In the Spanish Civil War, General Franco, supported by Mussolini and Hitler and Pope Pius the 11th and Pope Pius the 12th, that they are victorious in the Spanish Civil War, and Franco is dictator for many decades afterwards. Shortly after these ideological enemies are finished with their proxy war, they horrify the world by going into an alliance, and this was not something that was expected. And this was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Molotov from Russia, I think his grandson is still involved in Putin's government today. Ribbentrop from Germany, meet representing their particular countries, and sign this pact shortly after midnight, negotiating through midnight. The purpose of this pact was for the invasion of Poland, war with the West. So on the 1st of September 1939, just very, very shortly after this pact is signed, a number of days, Hitler orders the invasion of Poland. He knows that he can now take on the West without fearing a two-front war. He faced 3 allies, France, Britain and Poland, that had signed an agreement shortly before that if Hitler invaded Poland, it would be war. 3 allies versus Germany, backed by Russia. So you can see we are paralleling these lines. You have the period of 10, then you have this Spanish Civil War, Demetrius frees Athens. There is an alliance which is tested at this first battle. Then you have the division of territory. Pyrrhus and Demetrius divided Macedonia. Hitler and Stalin divided Eastern Europe. This puts a huge strain on their relationship. Pyrrhus invades Thessaly in 291, and in August of 1940, the all-important trade agreement between Hitler and Stalin is suspended. Hitler needed that trade agreement to wage war with the West. Some of his supplies, when invading Russia itself, would have run out before the first day of that invasion was over if he had not already received those supplies from the Soviet Union. This pact is officially broken up in 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Operation Redbeard is what Barbarossa means, why Hitler chose that name, when Germany invaded the USSR. Also, gas chambers came into being in 1941. This was, of course, the persecution starting long before, but this was a major escalation where if Hitler was going to wage a two-front war, he couldn't afford the men to be running concentration camps. He just needed the people gone, so it just becomes a mass genocide. 1945, Pyrrhus joins the Allied forces, Russia joins the Allied forces. Demetrius is defeated, Germany was defeated, and in both histories there is this division between the East and the West, this split between the East and the West. This sparks a Cold War. Here between Lysimachus and Pyrrhus, Lysimachus being a new antagonist of Pyrrhus, and here in comes the United States, and it's the USA versus Russia, the USSR. Lysimachus won this Cold War through sanctions and subterfuge, Pyrrhus losing all of that territory he'd gained in Macedonia, except the borders of Epirus itself. The same thing, the USA through sanctions and the Solidarity movement took over all that portion of Eastern Europe. The USSR lost all but the borders of Russia itself. One thing I didn't note yesterday, which I do find interesting, is if we can just look at the 4 generations of the German government. The German Empire formed in 1871 to 1890. So I'll just rub this out. It was initially split, and it was brought together in those years by Bismarck. Oh yes, also yesterday we lined up the similarities between Stalin and Putin. No president before Putin had come from the poverty that mirrored Stalin. Both Stalin being a ground force during the beginning of the USSR, Putin ground force at the end of the USSR. Stalin appointed by Lenin, Putin appointed by Yeltsin, and both ruled in a very similar manner. So from the time Germany was formed, 1871 to 1890 under Bismarck, it was first ruled essentially by Bismarck, who formed the German Empire. First is under Bismarck. (1871 to 1890). The second is known as the Wilhelmine era. Wilhelmine. And this is Kaiser Wilhelm. He didn't get along with Bismarck, so he had Bismarck removed from office, and he ruled as monarch. And that was 1890 to 1918. Him abdicating what ended the First World War. The third is the Weimar Republic. The extremely dysfunctional government that formed after World War I. And that was from 1919 to 1933. 1933, in comes the Nazi Party. Under Hitler. 1933 to 1945. We saw that at the beginning of our line with Pyrrhus, we could mark the number 4 repeatedly, this being the 4th Diadochi War, and there were a few other 4s in that era. And down here we can also mark the number 4. 4th generation of German government. We also saw that that pact was not admitted to until 1989, when the senior Politburo member conceded August 19 of 1989, that there was without a doubt collusion between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So that was something that they did not admit to for many years. We also looked at the Vatican involvement in this history, tying back to our first studies on Fatima. We saw that the USA under Roosevelt was not useful to the papacy at this time because who they saw as the most common enemy was Nazi Germany, not communist Russia. And at that point, the Vatican and the United States could not come into agreement. So, we're just about done with revision. We'll just finish this, tidy off the end of World War II. So in 1945, we have the beginning of a Cold War with the United States. This is a quote from Office of the Historian, the Bureau of Public Affairs from the US Department of State. They say wartime relations, this is World War II relations, between the United States and the Soviet Union can be considered one of the high points in the long-standing interaction between these two great powers, although not without tensions, such as differing ideological and strategic goals and lingering suspicions. The collaborative relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union nonetheless was maintained. Moreover, it was instrumental in defeating Nazi Germany in 1945. Recognizing the strong position that the Soviet army held on the ground, Churchill and an ailing Roosevelt agreed to a number of things with Stalin. At Yalta, they granted territorial concessions to the Soviet Union and outlined punitive measures against Germany, including Allied occupation and the principle of reparations. Stalin guaranteed that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan within 6 months after the end of hostilities in Europe. While the diplomats and politicians engaged in trying to shape the post-war world, Soviet forces from the east and Allied forces from the west continued to advance on Germany. After a fierce and costly battle, Berlin fell to Soviet forces on May 8 of 1945. After Allied and Soviet troops had met on the Elbe River to shake hands and congratulate each other on a hard-won impending victory. Soviet forces from the east and Allied forces from the west. So we saw three superpowers, the United States, France and Britain, united with the USSR to fight against a common enemy. But particularly marked in this history is the United States from the west and the USSR from the east that descended on Germany. This was very much a disappointment for the Vatican. So, 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as the two world superpowers, and a period of tensions began between the Soviet-backed Eastern Bloc and the US-backed Western Bloc, known as the Cold War. In 1948, the United States began a campaign of economic sanctions against the Soviet Union that would last more than 50 years. In March of that year, the Department of Commerce announced restrictions on exports to the Soviet Union and its European allies. That's from AmericanForeignRelations.com. So the elements of the strategy are listed by Time magazine in 2001, who gives a nice comprehensive list, was the US defense build-up, covert operations aiming at encouraging reform movements in Hungary, Czechoslovakia and Poland, financial aid to Warsaw Pact nations, calibrating to their willingness to protect human rights and undertake political reforms, economic isolation of the Soviet Union and the withholding of Western and Japanese technology, and the increased use of Radio Liberty, Voice of America and Radio Free Europe to transmit the administration's messages to the peoples of Eastern Europe. So you can see sanctions and subterfuge, or the solidarity movement particularly. Do we have any questions of World War II? Do we notice a change of scene in 1989? Can we mark a change of scene? Here it appears that the King of the South has been defeated. I would like to suggest that 1989 marks a shift in this war, where it appeared to end, but all it did was change in its location and appearance. This is no longer a war for Europe, this becomes global. It is no longer the Soviet Union, it is now Russia. In 285 BC, we also see a change of scene to new symbology for the King of the North and the King of the South. This is Rome versus Tarentum. Tarentum being the dominant city-state holding sway over southern Italy. So in 285 BC, one of the city-states under its sphere of influence changes its alliance from that of Tarentum to that of Rome. In 1989, we see Poland and those other Soviet Union satellite states begin to change their alliance from that of Russia to that of the West. Question: did America agree to not extend their influence into Soviet Union satellite states? Was there what you could describe as an ancient pact that they would not do this? We saw that the reason that Tarentum attacked Thurii and the Roman fleet is because in their mind there's a long-standing pact that you don't extend into their territory, and they considered the south of Italy and particularly that bay as their territory. The goal at Yalta and in subsequent meetings of the wartime allies was to establish stable European arrangements so that a World War III would not follow the Second War as inexorably as World War II followed the First. To that end, Roosevelt and Churchill accepted the idea that the Soviet Union would have legitimate, long-term security interests in Eastern Europe. That was the point of the deal Churchill offered to Stalin in Moscow, October 1944. On a slip of paper that he passed across the table to the Soviet leader, Churchill suggested mathematical formulas for post-war predominance in Eastern Europe. He suggested that the Soviets enjoy 90% predominance in Romania, 75% in Bulgaria, 50% in Hungary and Yugoslavia, and 10% in Greece. In each of these countries, according to Churchill's proposal, Britain and its friends would enjoy the influence that was left. 10% in Romania to 90% in Greece. Stalin accepted the deal on the spot. But there were grave flaws in this proposition, as there were in the Yalta agreements later. For one, Churchill never spelled out what 25 or 50% influence in one of these countries might mean in practice. For another, Churchill skipped over Poland. Was Yalta a permanent arrangement? How could it be? Yalta and the other post-war arrangements were no more permanent than the underlying conditions that bred them. All of those conditions have changed with one crucial exception. The Soviets still believe that in return for the 20 million people they lost in World War II, they deserve neighbours who won't threaten their security. And they have the military power on the ground to enforce that view. That was the Washington Post, January 12 of 1982, still well inside the Cold War. So while the United States might think that those agreements put over slips of paper handed over during the Yalta conferences and those subsequent conferences at the end of World War II are no longer binding, Russia still very much believes that they are, and we can know that because Putin brings them up so often, still bringing them up today. Leaders in Moscow tell a different story to that of the West. For them, Russia is the aggrieved party. They claim that the United States also failed to uphold a promise that NATO would never expand into Eastern Europe. This was a deal made during the 1990 negotiations between the West and the Soviet Union over German unification. In this view, Russia is being forced to forestall NATO's eastward march as a matter of self-defence. And this is very much the argument that Putin makes and that the Russian people largely buy. The West has vigorously protested that no such deal was ever struck. However, you will find hundreds of memos, meeting minutes and transcripts from US archives that do indicate otherwise. After the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Europe's regional order hinged on the question of whether a reunified Germany would be aligned with the United States and NATO, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, or neither party. Policymakers in the George Bush administration decided in early 1990 that NATO should include the reconstituted German Republic. In early February of 1990, US leaders made the Soviets an offer. According to transcripts of meetings in Moscow on February 9, then Secretary of State James Baker suggested that in exchange for cooperation on Germany, the US could make, quote, ironclad guarantees that NATO would not expand, quote, 1 inch eastward. Less than a week later, Gorbachev agreed to begin reunification talks. No formal deal on this was ever struck, but from all the evidence the quid pro quo was clear. Gorbachev acceded to Germany's Western alignment, and the US would limit NATO's expansion eastward. Has the US limited NATO's expansion eastward? No. This is Putin's argument today. Russia strongly believes that an understanding of their control over the countries east of the Elbe River, which runs through Germany, has applied since the Yalta Conference. This is an argument Putin has been known to make, particularly as it also relates considering this verbal agreement in 1990 on the expansion of NATO. So that's some background into what happens next, because we can see these Eastern European countries allied to the West between 1989 and 1991 as they threw off the yoke of the Soviet Union. I want to begin, as I said, to begin with, all I wanted to do was lay out history. No application, let's just look at history. We're finished doing that now and it's time to start looking at some applications. So 1989, we have a change of scene. Thuri is split into two factions. You have the Democrats and the aristocrats. A city-state with two factions, one wanting the traditional alignment with their relatives under Tarentum, the other wanting the financial benefits of an alliance with Rome. Where do we see that happen in Eastern Europe? Ukraine. First in 1989, first in 285. Then they come back. We want to have a little look at Ukraine. Ukraine is split into two factions. One want to ally with the West for the financial benefit. One, the traditional alignment with Russia. This back and forth tussle accelerated when Viktor Yanukovych came to power. Yanukovych was always pro-Russian, historically pro-Russian. Another Putin puppet, you could argue. He already had a reputation for corruption, having engaged in voting fraud in a previous election and being charged with that. But to win the presidency, he rebranded himself as friendly to the West and considering serious integration into the European Union and NATO. So first of all, he runs as a political candidate, making it clear that he is closely allied with Russia and Vladimir Putin. That does not end well for him, particularly when it's proven that he engaged in voter fraud during that election, and his victory is overturned in a recount. So he rebrands himself. He stops speaking Russian. He learns the Ukrainian language, which before he only normally spoke in Russian, and rebranded himself as someone that was favourable to the West. This rebranding was largely done by organised by an American consultant, Paul Manafort. Manafort was suggested to Yanukovych by Vladimir Putin. Russia told Yanukovych, "This man will help you rebrand." And then Paul Manafort lobbied for Yanukovych in Washington. Yanukovych wins that election, appearing to the people that he is pro-Western. That doesn't last long. In fact, it doesn't actually last past his victory speech, where after the whole election he switches back to speaking only Russian. The night that he wins the election. In November of 2013, the Euromaidan protests begin with a small protest in Independence Square. So now you have the fight between these two factions. They were looking to ally with the West. They want stronger integration with the European Union. On the 21st of November, the same day as the protest, Yanukovych abruptly changed his mind on an association agreement with the European Union, deciding instead to strengthen economic ties with Russia. A few days later, on November 30, a group of student protesters were attacked by police, leading to several injuries, and the protest became a national movement whose numbers swelled to nearly 1 million by December 8, just a couple of weeks. They continued to be attacked by police, resulting in civil unrest, and after the 16th of January 2014, violence escalated when Yanukovych signed the Bondarenko-Olinik laws, also known as the anti-protest laws, outlawing protests, political protests. Demonstrators then began to occupy provincial administration buildings in at least 10 Ukrainian regions. The country's lawmakers repealed 9 of the 12 restrictive laws he had passed on the 16th. By a show of hands, without a debate, so he begins to face opposition in his own party. Yanukovych offered to reshape his government with more opposition members, but they refused his offer, to the delight of the protesters. On the 28th of January, his prime minister resigned, and by February, Ukraine was on the brink of civil war. In those protests, 77 people had been killed. The evidence of corruption and regional cronyism in his government was building. With a net worth of $12 billion, Switzerland, Austria and Liechtenstein froze the bank accounts of his and his sons, pending a money laundering investigation. They later realised that he was siphoning his own country's money into private bank accounts to the rate of $12 billion. On the 12th of January 2015, Interpol issued a red notice for him on charges of misappropriation, embezzlement or conversion of property by malversation, if committed in respect of an especially gross amount. For most of his career, his salary never exceeded $2,000 a month, so to have a net worth of $12 billion is a little bit suspicious. If you ever want to go on YouTube and see a video recording of his home estate, it's worth seeing. $100,000 for each chandelier, a crowned copper roof, a private zoo, an underground shooting range, 18-hole golf course. His expenses include $800 medical treatment for his fish, $14,500 on tablecloths, and nearly $42 million for light fixtures. Also received were files on all of his perceived enemies, especially media members, some of whom he had been persecuted. The cost he was paying for monitoring the mass media was reportedly $5.7 million for just 1 month. Much of the threatening, attacking and torturing of Ukrainian protesters, and also confirmed account of voter intimidation and attacking of election officials, was perpetrated by the Perkut, the controversial national police force under his personal command. On the 22nd of February 2014, 328 of 447 members of the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove him as president. He was then disowned by his own party, the Party of Regions, and an arrest warrant was issued on the 24th of February. On the 21st of February, though, he decided to take a presidential inspection tour that conveniently took him outside of the country and into Russia. He was desperate to make it look like he wasn't running away. He asked the governor of Kharkiv to pick out a few factories for me to visit on this presidential inspection tour. On the 26th of February, Russian media company RBC reported his presence in Moscow. On the 27th of February, a report stated that Yanukovych had asked the authorities of the Russian Federation to guarantee his personal security in the territory of Russia, a request that they accepted. Now wanted for treason, he has remained protected in Russia ever since. On March 4, 2014, Russia's permanent representative to the UN, Cherkin, displayed a photocopy of a letter allegedly signed by Viktor Yanukovych on the 1st of March, requesting Russian military intervention in Ukraine to restore law and order. An alleged request that they certainly fulfilled. In 2014, Russia invades Ukraine, annexing Crimea. So you see these two opposing factions inside Ukraine, this battle that's going on. And the winning party, out of that essential civil war, allies with the West. Russia doesn't tolerate that, and in 2014, Russia invades the Ukraine. This desire to join NATO and the European Union violated, for Vladimir Putin, an ancient pact. So we come to 280 BC and we see Pyrrhus arriving in Tarentum. When we start dealing with the arrival of world leaders, we have to be a little bit careful, because we might see their arrival as their election to power. And we know that that isn't always the case. We can see that at Raphia we mark Napoleon. But Trump is in power since 2016. What it's marking is a change in that government structure, in that power. And I'd like to have a look at what happened in 2016 with Vladimir Putin. This is Pyrrhus taking control of Tarentum, taking control of the south. So when does Napoleon arrive? We know he arrives at Raphia. So what we're... Sorry? Yeah. Yeah. Just marking that when we see world leaders arrive on the scene. 2011, we saw these building revolutions. We saw what's known as the colour revolutions, and this also takes place in Russia. What happened in 2011 with those colour revolutions, also in 2011 with Vladimir Putin announcing that he's coming back for a third, though non-consecutive term, caused the largest protests inside Russia that had occurred since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Putin's own words, "We see what tragic consequences the wave of so-called colour revolutions led to. We should do everything necessary so that nothing similar happens in Russia." He's watched these revolutions go through many of his allies, particularly in 2011 with the death of Gaddafi in a CIA orchestrated coup. So 2011 is a very interesting year to get inside Putin's mind. He's watching these protests, these people rising up across many of his allied countries. Particularly, he's observing Libya. As an ally of Gaddafi, when Gaddafi dies, and it's a horrific death, he's dragged out of the tunnel and abused and murdered by soldiers, all of that was taped. Insiders in the Kremlin claimed that Vladimir Putin sat down and watched that tape 3 times over back to back of his ally's death, and he stood up and said, "Never again, never again." What is happening for Vladimir Putin never again in 2011? Never again is a CIA orchestrated coup actually done, overseen by Hillary Clinton, which is another insight into his mind which becomes relevant later on. Never again is the US toppling an ally, and we see that his behaviour here changes from Ukraine to Syria. Since 2011, Vladimir Putin has not given an inch. 2011, he's watching these protests, which he publicly says is all fomented by the United States, and then they happen inside his own country, the largest protest since 1991, and he blames that also verbally, publicly on Hillary Clinton. So what he does over 2015 and establishes in 2016 was the establishment of a Russian National Guard. This was composed initially of 187,000 troops under the command of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, but it soon blossomed into an army of 350,000 to 400,000 troops, loyal and answering to only one person, Vladimir Putin. What he has done is created his own personal army. This is his Praetorian Guard. Its commanding general is Viktor Volotov, who was Vladimir Putin's bodyguard for many years, since 1998 actually. The National Guard has the right to arrest anyone without a judicial order, to shoot anyone without warning, to disband any organisation considered dangerous to him or to Russia's national security. If anyone doubted its arbitrary toughness, it moved quickly to absorb so-called Kadryovsky or Chechen troops loyal to strongman Kadyrov and known for their brutality into its ranks. Like most autocrats, Putin has come to believe that he alone can save Russia from internal subversion and foreign aggression. Though he had, and still has, authority over an organised military force numbering 771,000 troops, sailors and airmen, a domestic police force of nearly 1 million officers, and an untold number of security troops, he still wanted a personal National Guard of 400,000 troops for his own personal protection. What he's doing is not protecting himself against the United States, against foreign enemies, but protecting himself against his own people. So Pyrrhus takes control of Tarentum, and according to the historical accounts, he set himself up as dictator from the time he arrived. Putin sets up his Praetorian Guard. And he's protecting himself against colour revolutions inside his own country. We then get to our 3 battles. Oh, also, if you want to list the military changes he made in 2016, just in October alone, he brought all nuclear-capable Iskander missiles into an enclave in Kaliningrad on Europe's doorstep and pointed them west. He moved a carrier battle group into the Mediterranean Sea to support his campaign in Syria. He announced a Russian naval facility in Syria to be upgraded to a full permanent naval base. He announced that the Russian air base in Latakia, Syria is a permanent air base. Military exercises were held with Egypt, and talks began with a view of reopening an old Soviet base in Egypt, and he pulled out of 3 nuclear agreements with the United States. That's marking his behaviour in 2016, and I'd like to suggest that just like Pyrrhus arrives and prepares for war, Putin arrived in 2016 and prepared for war. both with the West and also protecting himself in his own country. What we see shortly after that in the line of Pyrrhus is 3 battles. We'd already marked the Battle of Beneventum as Panium. And we'd been able to mark the, even note the name Beneventum as the Italian Salem. And not a personal expert on that at all, but I know studies have been done on Panium and the word Pan, and it was an interesting similarity. Pyrrhus there loses, and we know here that at Panium, Russia loses to the United States. I would then like to suggest that there is an alliance here formed between the United Nations. And I'd like to suggest that in this context, Egypt is not the king of the south as Russia is defeated, but becomes the United Nations. In the same way, this is not the armies of Rome. It isn't the armies of Rome that come as a flood, and this is the rise of the papacy. Sunday law. We can mark the 46th, the final and complete and total fall of Russia, where it begins to be ruled by the United Nations. And also Rome goes back, sends ambassadors back to Egypt as led by Fabius Maximus Gergus, whose name means the maximum flood. So we have 2 battles to contend with. If this is Panium, I like to suggest that this is Raphia. In between Raphia and Panium, we see Pyrrhus desecrate a temple. We see his behaviour as a dictator noted. He'd been a dictator long before this, but this is when it's particularly noted in history. And I'd like to suggest that we have one more battle, and I would like to suggest that this lines up with our loud cry. It's half the size of Raphia. Putin is not yet ready, but it's forced on him. When we see this smaller battle, we know that all of our internal events also are mirrored by external events. So it's not a new concept that when we have an internal event that it is also mirrored by something externally. And I would like to suggest that is Heraclea. Another thing I'd like to suggest is that while Russia loses at Panium, its decline is progressive between Panium and Sunday law, and at Sunday law it ceases to exist. It's fully destroyed. The mistake of 1989 is not repeated. There's no stump left in the ground to regrow. They don't make that mistake again. In Sunday law, the job's complete. So we know from our kings of Epirus, that Pyrrhus is Vladimir Putin. But we also noticed that Putin is Stalin. So if Putin is Stalin, what is this history here? We've made application that this history is this history. But I'd like to suggest this history isn't just this history, but it's also this history here. And if it's this history here, it's this history here. We have 4 lines. And what we need to do is cut them and overlay them. Where are we going to cut them? Change of scene. This is both an end and a beginning. This is both an end and a beginning. To save time, I've already drawn that up, and we will go through it slowly in the time we have left. Just spin that. And what we're going to do is take our lines, cutting them at the change of scene and overlaying. We'd already made application of one history, and that's this history here. What we need to do before we continue is note a problem that you've probably already seen. First line, Pyrrhus versus Demetrius. Second line, Pyrrhus versus Rome. Third line, Russia versus Germany. Fourth line, Russia versus USA. What we have is an alpha and omega of Pyrrhus's life, and what we have is an alpha and omega of the King of the South. But what we need to note before we make application is that between an alpha history and an omega history, there are some changes, some differences. For example, here, Pyrrhus loses all but Epirus, but does he lose his own kingdom? No. Here, what does Pyrrhus lose? Everything. 1989, does Russia lose everything? No. In our history at Sunday Law, loses everything. Up here, who's defeated? Demetrius. Who's defeated? Pyrrhus. King of the North defeated, King of the South defeated, King of the North defeated, King of the South defeated. Back here, Demetrius invades Epirus. This is King of the South defeated, King of the North defeated, King of the South defeated, King of the North defeated. Pyrrhus invades Thessaly. He never has to fight in this battle. In this battle, if I'll bring my... But he is driven away. I would suggest that this was a victory for Demetrius, King of the North, King of the South, King of the North, King of the South. What we notice between an alpha history and an omega history is we need to change the victor and also the antagonist. So to make that clearer, I just want to draw that up, that this is partial. This is a partial victory for the King of the North. This is a total victory for the King of the North. This is a partial victory for the King of the North. So this waymark must be a total victory for the King of the North. This is a victory for the King of the South. This is a victory for the King of the North. This is a victory for the King of the South. Panium, a victory for the King of the North. Demetrius invades Pyrrhus. This is a victory for the King of the North. The Battle of Asculum. This is a victory for the King of the South. Down here, this is a victory. Up here, Operation Barbarossa, King of the North. Down here, victory, King of the South. And one last one. This is a victory for the King of the North. Easily expels Pyrrhus from his territory. Pyrrhus just turns tail and runs. Victory for the King of the South at Heraclea. Russia suspended trade, but the economic agreement Russia got out of that suspension was better than anything they'd have before, and they did not have to pay their debts. This was a victory for the King of the North. And in our history, at the loud cry, we will see a small victory for the King of the South. Is that confusing? So we have Macedonia, Italy, World War II, and modern history. Pyrrhus versus his first enemy, Demetrius. But then we see in this history that his enemy changes from Demetrius to Lysimachus. Down in this history, we see Russia versus Germany, but their enemy changes from Germany to the United States. And I'd like to suggest that also in Russia, in modern history, it changes from the United States to the United Nations. There is another change there. We've already made application of one history, so we can essentially drop our dates. We know this as 1989. Can we mark 10 years before 1989? 1979, beginning of the Afghanistan War. War in Afghanistan. Is that a proxy war that ends in 1989? At the same time we note this proxy war, we also see those satellite states of the Soviet Union change their allegiance to the West from Russia. Question. We lined up Tarentum attacking Suri with Ukraine. So 2014, we see civil war in the Ukraine and the invasion of Russia. What about these two? What about an alliance between the King of the North and the King of the South? What was that alliance designed to enable? What threefold enemy does the King of the North need to take on in 2016? I'd like to suggest the three branches of the United States government. We saw an alliance between the King of the North and the King of the South created to take on the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch of the United States government. Executive, judicial, and legislative. Hitler took Poland, and then it was a prolonged war with the West. Trump took the executive branch, and then it's a prolonged war with the West. One was a fast victory, it was done in a day. The rest is a process. But he entered this battle with an important ally, Putin. I've suggested before, where we made application of this line, that their relationship sours at our loud cry. Pyrrhus invaded Thessaly. Up here, then we saw the Battle of Heraclea here, King of the North, King of the South, Russia suspended trade, and then down here, at our loud cry, we have a repeat of the Battle of Heraclea, where the King of the South has a Pyrrhic victory. We saw then in this history that Pyrrhus's allies who'd held off begin to join him, and he begins to have much more support from the surrounding countries that have seen him win this victory. But he holds off over winter, and then they meet again at Raphia, a battle twice as large, twice as big. What won Heraclea? Elephants. What wins Raphia? Elephants. What wins Beneventum? Panium. It's the same mode of warfare all the way through. Question. Where did we first see elephants in our history? The Battle of Ipsus, right here. This is our new mode of warfare. Elephants won the Battle of Ipsus. just like they won Heraclea, Asculum and Beneventum. We have Ipsus, Heraclea, Asculum and Beneventum. Not 2 battles, not 3, but 4 in our history that we need to understand. All of these battles have one common denominator. They're all decided by elephants, this new mode of warfare. This first battle, the King of the North and the King of the South enter as allies. World War II gives us one interesting perspective. It shows us that this war has 2 fronts. It has a Western front and an Eastern front. That Western front began in 2016. This is the Western front of World War III. The Eastern front begins at Raphia in earnest. And what does the Eastern front look like? It looks like the Western front. So when we turn on our news and we see our journalists frantic, and we see the world in a storm politically, and we see 2 sides split as much as they are, what are we watching? We're watching the Western front of World War III. What 2016 looked like is what Raphia looks like. If we want to understand Raphia before we get to time, we need to understand what happened in 2016 and 2014. They will tell us the future that we're expecting to see. This same mode of warfare carries us all the way through. And what was 2016? It was an information war. We say in this movement readily that between 1989, after 1989, in that increase of knowledge, this movement, all of the information that we need in this movement was planted. It was in that increase of knowledge. We have no new message. Then I would like to suggest that if we're looking to know what the future holds, then just maybe externally, with external events, with Raphia and Panium, the seeds to understand that go right back to 1989. We're not going to see some new weapon that hasn't already existed in that history. I might close for time because we want to look at what information war is, and that is a line and a subject in itself. We need to not go back to 2016 but to 1989. So if you wouldn't mind, we'll close early today. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for your blessings. Thank you that in these histories, Lord, and in just our last 30 years as a movement, you don't leave us in ignorance of what we're facing, what we have faced, what is happening right now, Lord, today, 2018, in the world around us. I pray, Lord, that we will be prepared both in heart and mind. I pray for our families, Lord, our loved ones. Each head bowed, Lord, has those on their heart and mind that are not prepared for what's coming. And I pray, Lord, that you'll give us wisdom as we interact with them, and that you might send your angels to work with them, to, Lord, draw their hearts and minds after you. I pray, Lord, for this mission that you've raised us up to do, that individually and as a movement we will take our place in that line of soldiers, Lord, and fit ourselves for the coming conflict. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.